Hey guys, so I'm making a review of this book, Immortal Remains, The Evidence for Life After Death by Stephen E. Braude. A really fascinating read and a very interesting topic. Who wouldn't want to know if there was evidence for us surviving death, that what makes me, me, actually transcends death and exists post-mortem? And what's cool is that the author, Dr. Stephen E. Braude, is an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Maryland. So he brings in a significant rigor and a skeptical methodology, but not necessarily a radical skepticism to this field, which I think is really important because there's a lot of nonsense and, maybe some overly credulous information gathering and writings on this topic. So it's cool to have someone of his caliber actually writing on this field. And he himself actually had a paranormal experience when he was a graduate, which seems to have really sparked his interest in his topic. But what's also interesting about this book is that it's not really written for the skeptic per se, meaning if you're someone who doesn't believe in the paranormal, um, this is not really the book for you, and I'll explain why. Because the book presupposes that paranormal events occur, that things like ESP, telekinesis, psychokinesis are occurring. This book is actually targeting more for other scholars who already accept the reality of the paranormal, the reality of these psychokinetic phenomena. And what it's arguing is that we have to factor in an alternative hypothesis when it comes into life after death. And I'll go into that now. It's called the Superpsy Hypothesis. So, to put this in an analogy, if you go to a medium, and let's just, for the sake of argument, say that this is a genuine medium, and you go in there to, let's say, get information about your grandfather and connect with your grandfather, if the medium starts giving you information about your grandfather that is accurate, doesn't necessarily mean that the medium is actually connecting with your grandfather. The alternative hypothesis is that the medium is extracting information from you through telepathy or clairvoyance, and then they're regurgitating it to you to make you think that they're connecting with your grandfather. Alternatively, you may have some latent ESP abilities that you're not aware of, and you are subconsciously giving the medium information about your grandfather, and then they're regurgitating it. Okay, so this is called Superpsy hypothesis, and it negates the survivalist hypothesis, which is simply that the medium is connecting with the disincarnate soul, or for lack of a better word, psyche, or whatever you want to put in that place. So the question is, how do we differentiate between superpsy and survival? And how can we actually exclude superpsy to the point where we can say that the survival hypothesis is the best explanation? And this is what Dr. Braude's book is delving into. So he's not trying to prove to the skeptic that survival is real. Rather, he is trying to elevate the field to being more critical and scrutinizing the level of evidence so that the bar can be raised, so that we can look for um, better cases and that we can form better cases to exclude this hypothesis so that we can more securely believe in survival. All right. So I'll go over a couple of examples, and he goes over a ton. Detailed cases, mediums, what they call drop in cases, cases of reincarnation, cases of possession. A really interesting case regarding a medium by the name of Pearl Coran and an alleged disincarnate person named Patience Worth that she connected with. Very fascinating. I can't go into it in this video, but I'll go over a couple of examples. And we'll start with Leonard Piper, who lived from 1857 until 1950. Now, this is obviously from Wikipedia, and I have to warn you, do not trust what you necessarily read off of Wikipedia. I know that's probably maybe somewhat superfluous to be telling you that. But needless to say, I just glanced through this. This is like highly skeptical information about Miss Piper. What's cool about Braude's book is that he actually provides the original data, or at least excerpts of it, so you can actually see why these cases are so remarkable. And I assure you, this is a really, really fascinating case. So, Miss Piper would fall into a trance, and then she would connect with what's called a control. So, very common among mediums. They're not dealing with spirits directly. Usually, there's some kind of intermediary figure that connects them to the spirit that they're trying to connect with. Now, what's interesting is that these controls, although they tend to reveal themselves to have some kind of personal name or a connection to a historical figure, they tend not to be correct. So, it's believed that these controls are actually the constructs of the medium's subconscious, or at least that's one theory. So Miss Piper's control was a being or a construct by the name of Dr. Finowit. And there was one absolutely fascinating case where Miss Piper was met by a Mr. and Mrs. Sutton, or rather the Reverend Sutton and Miss Sutton. This was a case that was documented in December of 1893, and it was recorded by a veteran note taker known as Miss Howard. Now, the Reverend and Miss Sutton appeared to Miss Piper pseudonymously. So, in other words, she didn't know who these people actually were. They didn't tell her what her real name was, and entirely who they were trying to connect with. Now, this couple had lost their young daughter named Catherine, whose nickname was Khaki. And Dr. Braude provides a transcript from this seance where Miss Piper falls into a trance, Dr. Finowit appears, and then he's actually calling over their daughter who has passed on. And what's remarkable is if you read the actual transcript, just the flow of the narrative, how quickly the medium, Miss Piper, is providing information, how many hits she's getting, and how few, if any, errors are being made. It's truly, truly remarkable to read this. And just to name a couple of examples. So, like I said, the daughter's name was Catherine, but her pet name or nickname was Khaki, which Miss Piper obtained. Miss Piper knew that Khaki would chew on a silver medal, that she would chew on a string of buttons, that her brother's nickname was Dodo, that Khaki had a tongue issue, that her tongue was paralyzed. She knew that even what was interesting was even that the way that when Miss Piper was under trance, how she would replicate the way that Khaki would talk. So, for example, Khaki wouldn't pronounce her R's as many children do. They would pronounce it as a W. So instead of saying, "Daddy, can we ride the horsey?" the medium would say, "Daddy, can we wide the horsey?" So it's remarkable that the medium would even reproduce what Khaki was doing phonetically. She knew that Khaki's sister's name was Eleanor. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is that the medium sang two songs in a childlike voice during the trance that was exactly what Mr. and Mrs. Sutton's daughter would sing with them. Now, just stop and think about that. They reproduced the song that the daughter would sing. So, going over this, it was obvious to me that there's definitely something paranormal that happened there. But to introduce the thesis and the issue that Dr. Braude is trying to address, can we exclude the Superpsy hypothesis? So again, Superpsy is that the medium is utilizing their ESP abilities to extract information from the sitters. In other words, from Mr. and Mrs. Sutton. And here is where the dilemma is, because in this case, it's certainly possible that she was obtaining information from the sitters. And so the question is, well, how can we actually rule out the Superpsy hypothesis? And this is what Dr. Braude is trying to get at, is that it's actually very difficult to do this, and that this alternative hypothesis actually can pose a lot of problems. And it's why investigators and researchers need to elevate the bar when it comes to dealing with paranormal cases. So let's take a look at another example. And this one will actually shift gears into showing why we may be dealing with a survival hypothesis. So this is Miss Gladys Osborne Leonard, and she lived from 1882 to 1968. She was a British trance medium, and her control was a being or construct by the name of Theta, who claimed to be a spirit of from an Indian girl who lived in the 19th century. So again, these may be constructs created by the medium. But what Miss Leonard was known for were the so-called book tests, where basically um, she would meet with a sitter and she would advise a sitter to look on their bookshelf, pick out a certain book, look at a certain page, and there will be a message written within that book. So I'll give you folks an example. This is from Dr. Braude's book, Immortal Remains. It is from page 74, where he quotes one of the seances where Miss Leonard performed a book test. And this one was recorded from a Miss Sigwick, where it says, quote, "An anonymous sitter, Miss Talbot, received through Theta a message from her late husband advising her to look for a relevant passage on page 12 or 13 of a book on her bookcase at home. Theta said that the book was not printed but had writing in it, was dark in color, and contained a table of Indo-European, Aryan, Semitic, and Arabian languages, whose relationships were shown by a diagram of radiating lines. Miss Talbot knew of no such book and ridiculed the message. However, when she eventually looked and found at the back of a top shelf a shabby black leather notebook of her husband's, pasted into this book was a folded table of all the languages mentioned, while on page 13 was an extract from a book entitled Post Mortem. In this case, the message related to a book unknown to medium and sitter. Indeed, so far as could be told to any living person, but undoubtedly known to the communicator." Okay, so what was interesting here was that a sitter came to Miss Leonard. Miss Leonard told them, again under trance, under the control Theta, to look for a particular book that was leather bound. And this sitter, Miss Talbot, scoffed at the idea. She thought it was ridiculous at what was being suggested. Now, this is important because when we're trying to rule out super psi versus survival, in this case, we can't say that the medium was using ESP to get information from Miss Talbot because Miss Talbot thought that the suggestion was nonsense. So this is an important establishing fact because, again, this tends to lean towards survival. And this is, again, where the cases where Dr. Braude is trying to focus on. Now, what's also interesting is that Miss Osborne, or Miss Leonard's rather, success rate. Now, Miss Sigwick collected and analyzed these book tests, and she found that of 532 book tests, 17% were successful, and an additional 19% were approximately successful. Now, you might say that's not a great percentage. It's not 100%, but they actually did some controlled experiments where they took 60 participants and they had them, these were not mediums, they had them perform some 1,800 control tests where basically they would have just randomly pick out a book and try to see if they can find a message on a particular page. And their success rate was 2%, and their partial success rate was less than 3. So you can see that Miss Leonard, although she wasn't hitting a 100% success rate, there's still a statistically significant difference there. She has more than an order of magnitude of more success rates and more approximate success rates than the controlled subjects. Now, the interesting thing is we don't really know how psychic phenomena works. So we can't really criticize Miss Leonard for only getting 17% and not 100% because, again, you know, when it comes to telepathy or clairvoyance or mediumship, it might not be like you listening to my video right now. It might be more like us trying to communicate with you on a mountain with poor reception. So not everything in our conversation might be going through at that point. And something similar or analogous might be occurring with paranormal phenomena. But still, when we're looking at the percentages, there's definitely a statistically significant difference there. So something paranormal was occurring. And in this case, it appears we're dealing with something that is more along the lines of a survival hypothesis. Now, the last thing I want to go into is a reincarnation case that Dr. Braude goes into, and this is the case of Sumitra Singh, a 17-year-old Indian woman who was married at a young age, had a child, and she became possessed. So actually, it's not really reincarnation, it's more of a possession case, where basically she had said that on a particular day she would die, or she said something to the effect like, in 3 days I will die. On the third day, she did appear to die, according to her family, and then she resuscitated. And when she resuscitated, she claimed to be another person by the name of Shiva. And as it turns out, a lot of the information that Sumitra was providing was actually corroborated by the family of Shiva, and they became convinced that she was actually in some sense possessed by their dead daughter's spirit. So I want to go over a couple hits that that she got here. So, for example, when Sumitra was first introduced, and this is from page 202 in Dr. Braude's book, I'm quoting here. When Sumitra was first introduced to Ram Sia, whom she had been told was that is Shiva's father, she called him Papa, which Shiva had also done, and she wept. And after he asked her, Sumitra gave 2 pet names by which Shiva was known in her family. One of these, Shiv Shankar, had not been published in the newspaper report of Shiva's death. So that's important because we're ruling out any potential way that Sumitra could have been getting information, you know, unconsciously or just in the course of her daily life. So this is a pet name that was never revealed, that she correctly named. Sumitra recognized Ram Rani, who was Shiva's mother, when she paid her first visit to Itawa. Ram Sia tried to mislead Sumitra. Ram Rani was inside the house, and Ram Sia told Sumitra that she was in a group of women standing near the house, but Sumitra insisted that her mother was not in that group, and when she went inside the house and found Ram Rani, she embraced her tearfully. So interesting. They're trying to deceive her, right, or test her rather, by saying that her mother is outside of the house when in fact she was inside, and she correctly identified the woman that was supposed to be her mother. Now, another point was that Sumitra recognized 15 members of Shiva's family in photographs shown to her by Ram Sia, including one of his wife and children taken 18 years earlier. Sumitra recognized the picture of the young Shiva, saying, "This is me." She also recognized the picture of Shiva's sister-in-law, identifying her as the person who had hit her with a brick. She's mentioning this because the person Shiva who allegedly possessed Sumitra was said to have died tragically or had been murdered, apparently by her own family, or her in-laws specifically. So these are a couple points that Dr. Braude points out, but as you can see, um, this is all very remarkable. I mean, these hits that she's making, being able to identify 15 people, identifying pet names that she was supposedly called that no one had mentioned, that this was, within family. Also, the fact that they had tried to mislead her and that she would get this information correct. But again, we're dealing with the challenge of, could this have been a case of super psi? And again, this is where we're dealing with the challenge of this concept. So these are just three brief cases, very brief, that I went over, and Dr. Braude goes over many others. He goes over drop-in cases. He goes over a fascinating case with the Pearl Koran and Patience Worth, which is just mind-blowing of a case. He goes over hauntings. He goes over other possessions. I thought the transplant cases he mentioned were interesting as well, how when someone would get a heart transplant, that certain unique features of the donor would then begin to express themselves. So there was a situation where an elderly white gentleman, who unfortunately was a racist, was to receive a heart from an African American, a young African American who was really interested in classical music and he loved playing the violin. And suddenly, when the recipient got the heart, he just started having this profound love for classical music. And he's recorded as saying that, he can't possibly get a love for classical music from a heart from an African American because he would have been interested in rap, just something really stupid and ignorant like that. But I thought those cases were very interesting, and the ones that Dr. Braude selected are actually very funny as well. So again, just three cases, very brief cases we looked over. And again, we're looking at the issue of the Superpsy hypothesis. How do we rule it out to justify survival? Now, after Dr. Braude analyzes all these cases, he does come to the conclusion, albeit reservedly and conservatively, that we are justified to believe that, at least in some cases, people do survive for at least a period of time. Not necessarily eternally, not necessarily everybody in the world, but it seems that this does occur, that this phenomena is real. Now, after looking at all the cases, how does he come to the conclusion? He gives several reasons, but the two strongest reasons he gives for the survival hypothesis, number one, is that the evidence reinforces itself. So when we look at different cases, they all reinforce the support of the survivalist hypothesis. And so you can actually build a coherent narrative amongst all these cases that is best explained and most parsimoniously explained by the survival hypothesis. That's one reason. Now, the other reason is what Dr. Braude refers to as the argument from collapsing complexity. And this is his own contribution to this issue. So, what he basically says is that when we're dealing with super psi, we're dealing with multiple channels of paranormal or ESP that are involved. And the more channels that we have, the more difficult it is for this to be affected or effectual. So, in other words, if we're dealing with two alternatives, one is that you have a medium who is channeling through a single disincarnate psyche or soul, where they're getting all their information from. And then the other alternative is that the medium is in fact performing superpsy, getting information from the medium, getting information from the sitter, perhaps other family members from the sitter, and then they're trying to coalesce all this information to provide a believable storyline that they're communicating with a disincarnate spirit. Well, it overcomplicates the situation to the point where it makes it unbelievable that this can be occurring, right? So it's simpler to believe that there is a single channel of information from a single spirit, that the channel only needs to be interrupted, on occasion, and it'll still function. But if you have a superpsi hypothesis that deals with multiple channels, well, even a sporadic interruption makes the whole thing fall apart. So that is my attempt at trying to summarize what Dr. Braude's argument was. He obviously did it much more eloquently. But the point is that this, in combination with the previous reason, makes belief in life after death justifiable, at least in some cases. And I think that's very promising, because from there we can go on to more fundamental questions and issues. Thank you for listening.